I'm delighted to be here and chairing this panel. And I apologize that I'm not Sabyn Javeri. So those of you who were hoping to have Sabyn Javeri, I'm really sorry that you might be disappointed. My name is Victoria Schofield. And the reason I'm here is that I myself am a historian and journalist, and I've written a lot on Kashmir, and I've been studying the area and the conflict for some decades now. So I'm delighted to be in conversation with Dr. Nitasha Kaul, who's a friend, but more importantly, a multidisciplinary academic and a novelist. But she teaches at the University of Westminster in London, but we're really here today to talk to her in conversation in her capacity as a novelist. And I think some of the interesting things we're going to bring out is not just the novel, but also the mechanics of, you know, for those of you who are interested in literature, and this is a literary festival, in how you come to write a novel. So I have read Future Tense, and some books will be on sale afterwards, and there will be a book signing. So what I'm going to start with is why have you written this novel? And possibly when you found time to write it, because I think this is also the logistics. So why have we got a novel? And we'll move on to the internal aspects in a minute. Nitasha.
Okay. Thank you everyone for being here. It's always a great pleasure to talk about something that takes a long time to actually get out. So, you know, this is my second novel. The first one was called Residue, which is here. And if you ask me, if I ask you, what is the mammal with the longest gestation period? The answer is not whatever the scientists tell you. Yeah, the answer is actually a novelist. Because it takes a long time, and it literally feels like you're actually giving birth to a life. Because books are also thoughts as well as things. So why do I write? Years ago, I had a very brief interlude period in JNU between Delhi and London in the 90s. And I remember this creative gathering where somebody said, well, you know, why do we write? And as a precocious teenager, I remember quoting André Gide and saying something like, well, because I can't not. And I won't go quite as far as to say that, but I think that reading, writing, and being read are the ways of making meaning that I think are really profound and also enlivening. It's it's a way of working through something that you might see. For instance, you might see a tragedy or something that's exhilarating, and there are different ways to respond to that. Sometimes we want to know the mechanics of how that's come about. And sometimes, in addition to that, we also want to create our own stories. I think that's a very fundamental human instinct to tell stories in order to make sense of things. And that's just really powerful. So that's why I write. How do I find the time to write? You know, I'll say again something like a little piece of wisdom that somebody once said to me: you don't find time, you make time. It's actually true. It's a cliche, but it's true. If something really matters to you, you have to make the time for it. And as an academic, that's really hard. But, you know, there are times when I just have to find that time to just switch the world off and go into a cave where all I want to do is let the memories come in and let the words come out.
Yes, well, another of those cliches is for love, not money. And I think we're, you know, us all who write, we love. You have to love writing. You have to want to do it. Now, this novel, Future Tense, is obviously it's set in a particular epoch of history, and so what I suppose I want to know now is why did you know the events of 2016 in the Valley of Kashmir were very significant, and perhaps you can explain that as well. Why did you choose to write a novel sort of which had its focus on that particular period in Jammu and Kashmir's history?
Right. So Future Tense, as the title kind of indicates, this is meant to the alphabets are meant to look like barbed wire. It's meant to convey a sense of suffocation, and in a place which is often thought of as just beautiful, because it's and it is very beautiful, but it's not just beautiful. It's also beautiful, but deeply difficult for the people who live there. And the story is set in Srinagar mostly, but also Leh and the reason that I wanted to write this after 2016, I wrote this after the summer of 2016 when, if you remember, Kashmir is a non-linear conflict. Every few years you have something happen, and in 2016, following on from the killing of Burhan Wani, there was the summer of mass blindings when pellet guns were used on protesters. And it was following on from 8th July 2016 actually. And it was just one of those moments when there was a spontaneous sort of grief, and there were people who could relate to it and people who could not relate to it. And I was just very struck by, I think, the way in which that word, that name and identity meant something so different for different kinds of Kashmiris who were there and Kashmiris who were outside. So that was the sort of the proximate reason for writing then. But I think there are also stories that I wanted to tell in order to convey the idea that a conflict is not just something very dramatic that happens when you have somebody who faces, someone with a gun in a uniform. Yeah, that is part of a conflict. But a conflict is also something that you live with every day if you are living in a place that is torn by a conflict. So it affects every aspect of your life in terms of how you think, where you think you might work, what does taking up a job mean to you, who do you relate to, how do people perceive you. So I wanted to, so it's these characters who are essentially young people following their different paths, and their stories interconnect. And the sense of how their lives are marked by the inherited tragedies of that conflict.
Yes, we've got 4 males and 4 females. I'm not going to do any spoilers here. But I just want to sort of build up the actual body of the book. All your 4 males, they all have a sort of a separate story, and then, as you say, they then begin to interlink, and then the 4 females. How easy, again, as a novelist, have you found it to write, because you get in the head of, one chapter is in the head of one of the male characters, and then you get another chapter maybe in the head of another female characters. I mean, that's also quite a skill. Sometimes with a novel, you just hear through one head, but you've chosen to alternate, that you're in the heads, in a way, of the different characters. Did you find it easier to write the sort of the dialogue, the narrative for the women rather than the men, or did you find that just as easy?
I think that with, I'll come to the gender part in a somewhat roundabout way. When I wrote my first novel, Residue, I was not aware of something called the Bechdel test. Is anyone in this room aware of the Bechdel test? No? Okay. So I was not aware of it either. I wrote this novel, and then I came across and I came across that after the novel was published. So I read, Bechdel test is the fact that it's named after a literary, somebody who's a literary critic, and her name is Bechdel, if I remember correctly, Louise Bechdel. So she analyzed a whole range of literature and found that there are very few narratives, either novels or films, that actually have some kind of interaction and conversation between female characters, which is not about any men and does not concern itself with anything that has to do with the men in the story. So she found that an overwhelmingly large number of somebody is expressing assent, agreeing with me, that an overwhelmingly large amount of creative output, cultural output, actually has no depictions of interactions between women that is not mediated by men. So I was quite pleased, actually. Then I went back and looked at. I think that it really, it's really the character. There are different things that you attribute, and those things become more real, actually, as you start writing it. For instance, once you have the characters in your head, and then, in chapter 3 or whatever, you're writing about an exchange between the 2 people, you start to feel you are able to know what this person would say and what the other person would respond. And I think
You
that's,
begin to
that's
get
actually,
to know your characters.
Yeah, that's actually really fun because, every time I think of Rehan, for example, he has to have something that's, if he sits somewhere for a prolonged amount of time, he starts to have back issues. It's not important in the story at all, but that's just one of the things that is part of his character. And those personal little idiosyncrasies that make us as, human and real as people, I think are also things that fictional characters come to inhabit. And I think the other reason why it's a story with multiple characters is because the reality of other lives and the fact that we all have our reasons and our rationalities, whether they in the long run serve us or not, which are equally real. And I feel that that a story I'm with, I think it's a quote from Ian McEwan, that only in a story can you get into all of these heads and show that it is real. And I think that's really powerful because words make us believe things.
Yeah, well, exactly. Did you find you preferred some characters to the others? You got into the heads of even some of the women more easily than others, or as you get to know your own characters? Well, not necessarily, no.
That's actually a really hard question to pick whether I have
favorites.
Any favorites.
Yeah.
No, I think they all have things that I like or don't like as much, or that I can relate to, or that I would do in their place or not do.
Yes. I was just because sometimes one does, you feel, oh well, there's so and so, and you've got to know them, and then you really like writing about them, and then others maybe more difficult. Have you, when you write a novel, because again, as a historian, I know what my endings are because the facts are there. Do you always, in future tense, had you worked out when you started the novel where the characters were going to end, or do they also evolve? Or does the storyline evolve?
The story is nonlinear, so the novel is divided into 3 parts, and it begins with something that that the first chapters tell us of a certain situation, and then we go into the backstory of what actually. So the middle part of the book is what had actually happened before that first part. So it's what's happening now, and then what happened before, and then in the third part we resume back from the first part and we talk about what happens next. So I think that the thing about facts is also really interesting because there are certain factual instances, as I said, the 2016 summer, which is of course real, but also other factual instances that play a key role in the story, even though it is a fiction story. And one of them is the episode of the human shield, the usage of, the usage of a Kashmiri civilian man who was used as a human shield, and how that image with all of its kind of spectacular effect, that plays a role in one part of the story.
Well, that I think, I was going to come on to that. That is a very powerful part of it. And what I think we all know that it was in 2017, a young Kashmiri was tied to an army jeep, and he was sent through a village, several villages. And the idea was that if there was going to be some protests, they couldn't throw stones at one of their own citizens. But it created an absolute outcry, and factually, it was one of the episodes of human rights abuse which was mentioned in the UN report, which came out soon afterwards. But what you've done, which I think is very interesting, and it's sort of towards the end of the book, so we don't want to fast forward too much, but you've got your 8 characters, and they're all having a particular reaction, which again I think is very interesting because in terms of human nature, we all, to me, I don't know if this was why you wrote it, but I found it illustrative of the different people we are. And perhaps you might just like to, because I always think it's lovely to have a book read by the author, you might like to read that section, which is on page 264, and it starts with, we know the characters. We've got Imran, Fayaz, Rahan, and Gul. They're the 4 men. And then we've got Zinat, Saima, Shireen, and Ifra. They're the 4 women. So I think it'd be rather nice to hear Nitasha reading this section, which begins when he saw, right up to the end of, on 265, 100 years old.
Yes. And before that, just to let you know a little bit more about the characters. So Fayaz is a bureaucrat. He's also fairly aimless, and the book starts with his marriage to his wife Zinat breaking down. Rehan is a friend of Fayaz, so when I tell you, what each of them are doing as a response to how they're feeling, then that's who they are. Rehan is a journalist who is pursuing a very difficult profession in those circumstances, given the sorts of things that anyone might be saying to you, depending on what you write. Gul is a policeman. Zeenat is, of course, this person that the book starts with, and in fact also ends with. Saima and Shireen are friends, and Saima is studying in Delhi, and that's where she meets Shireen. And Shireen is this person. I think at some point we'll come to that bit about the Chinese characters, but anyway. Yeah. So in the backdrop of these characters and their lives are the floods, the fear, the barbed wire, and for Shireen, who's grown up outside and who's not a Kashmiri Muslim, there's a different history and a conflict. Birds, stones, shrines, everything means something, not just, something in relation to the conflict for them. So then the human shield thing happens, and there are also 3 other I wish, sometimes I just wish that I could have actually given the story away, but I can't.
No, mustn't have spoilers.
Because the third part, you just have to read it, yes. Otherwise there's no point. So in the third part, there's Imran, who wants to be, he's a young man, Fayaz's nephew, who wants to be a cricketer. That's his passion in life. But unfortunately, how is he going to play for Kashmir as a country for a cricket team? Because that doesn't exist, right? So Imran is this nephew of Fayaz, the bureaucrat, and he's got like strict relatives, and Bichor, who's this other character who is relevant in relation to the human shield but doesn't figure here. Okay, so when he saw the images and the video of the use of his fellow Kashmiri as a human shield, Imran wanted to go out and pelt every stone he could lay his hands on. Fayaz and Rehan were chillingly reminded of their childhood nightmares. Gul told his terrified family that this was nothing new. He's a policeman. Like many other young boys, he himself had been used as a civilian human shield during the search operations years ago. Many men remembered how back in the early years of the uprising, they were forced by the army to go into buildings that were to be checked for the presence of militants. Zeenat prayed, reaching the resolve that she would atone for her inability to fight the oppression by saving a life. Ifra composed letters to newspapers. Rehan wrote poetry in a drunken haze after his conversation with Saima about how miserable it was to be a helpless Kashmiri. Saima went online to battle the xenophobic Indian trolls who could see nothing wrong with what had happened. Shireen realized that this was not just an abstract tragedy for her either. This was the display of vile inhumanity that should offend a human being regardless of their identity. Men could be dolls too. This relates to something else earlier in the book. She wondered how the soldiers could follow orders that made them do such things. Then she realized that humanity lived in a world where the Holocaust was not even 100 years old.
Thank you, Nitasha. I think that's a very powerful couple of paragraphs, but also it's somehow, as I say, we are towards the end of the book, it brings your characters to show them in their different aspects. Rehan, the journalist, wanting to write the use of the internet. And one of the things that again comes out in the book, which I really urge you to read slowly, because Natasha's use of English is absolutely beautiful. She's got expressions like the phrases like taste of meat and misery mingled in his mouth. It's so rich in its description. The human skull is the brain with the brain of infinite possibilities. Encased in it was the first prison of the mind. I mean, think about that. It's really brilliant. And then we've got autumn deepened its palette outdoors, spreading a chill on the ground and setting fire to the leaves. How do you manage to, does it take time to craft a phrase or a sentence, or do they just come to you? Because I think, again, as a writer, and for all of us, using the medium of English to write in, that's part of the novel. You can have the storyline, you can have your characters, but it's also that description. And I'm just wondering how easy is that for you to come to?
Well, it's, I think it's why it's why one wants to write. So it is, I think part of the creative imagination is that you refuse to be bound by the constraints of what is in front of you, and you refuse to say, it's only this. Because you want to be able to say, yes, it's this, but it could be that, or it's a little bit like something else too. And you can, so it's the force of imagination. I think that's, that plays a really a powerful role. And thank you, by the way, for reading those words or phrases. It's always, as a creative person, when other people reflect on your work, it's almost like giving an insight into what the things that resonate with people. So I would say that no, it's a bit like you just imagine that that things could always be otherwise, that nothing is inevitable, and it's actually something that's very useful in daily life. If you have a series of endless gray, rainy days, it's a very useful faculty to be able to imagine sunshine. So, to be able to just think, well, the sunshine I carry within, so what if there's no sun? Let me just try and imagine a sun. And I think that's just really helpful. I think the force of imagination it's part of our human resilience. That is how we survive tragedies. That is how we kind of tide over everything that life and the world throws at us, is that we kind of keep hope, we try and keep thinking that things could be otherwise, and we refuse to give in to some kind of unchangeable brute reality. We always think there is another day, there's the miracle of the universe,
Yes, well, does that now account for your title? Because I want to come on to the title, and indeed, well, you talked a little bit about the actual cover and the design of the book, of the cover. The future tense, because you've got another wonderful section here, which is words. Words, what were they good for? Could anyone build a life from them? Could anyone keep believing in them? Words were overrated. They failed people at the specific instances when they were needed most. And so distances grow between people, and armies are always at war because no one can ever seem to find the right sequence of words when they are most needed. Now, for you audience listening, that is the philosophical paragraph in the middle of the novel, but it leads us on to the whole sort of questioning of words, use of words, and tenses, and future tense.
So that's true. I don't have to convince you. You're all here because you love books, so you obviously will agree with me that words are really powerful. But I think that, that words are, so I like to think of words as having a might. Might as in the sense that words are mighty, they have power. But also that words have a might in the sense of a maybe or a possibility. That words are things that may make things happen. So if you think about the most complex, intractable scenario, political, economic, whatever, ultimately, all of that is the result of powerful narratives. Before anyone to move anything, literally, you have to move something in the head. It's the ideas that drive the world. And where do we have those? Where do we get those narratives and ideas? From things that we get through words, because as human beings, that's how we communicate with each other. And yet, it's also fascinating and perhaps sad that we so often fail to communicate. That, whether it's individuals or collectivities or leaders or people, we're almost always also failing to communicate in lots of multiple ways, which is, and as a result of that, we have what we have in the world today. So the title Future Tense, I chose it because, and obviously there's a double meaning on the idea of the future and how, and in fact in one of the exchanges between I think Rehan and Shireen, they do talk about this idea of the future tense and it's of life being lived in the future tense. And the fact that there are languages that do not have tenses and words and so on. Anyway, so I wrote, the title was Future Tense because when I wrote the book, it was written into the future, as in the character. I wrote that, there's 2016, 2017, but I wrote it imagining things that happen in the book happen in the years afterwards. So, so it was always going to be called future tense. But then last year in 2019, which is when the book was going through its final stages, pre-publication final stages, the events of August 2019 happened. So it just lent this kind of renewed sense of urgency and importance to that story, because this was a story that I wanted to tell in the aftermath of 2016, and then 2019 happened, and all of that just became so much more real for a lot of people who previously weren't aware of it. So in that sense, I just felt that it just felt like But I mean, you often have this feeling as somebody who's writing things about how the relationship between the world and
yes. But
words.
the tenses, I mean, say you've got this, you do change the tenses, and sometimes it again takes you by surprise, but it seems to have a meaning rather than just keeping in the present.
So so there's one particular chapter, chapter 7
yes,
actually,
I think so.
which at the start of which, as an author, you write the text, and then it goes through various stages. There's the editor who looks at the big picture, and then the editor who looks at the detail of every line and verse and sentence, and you have a lot of back and forth with them, trying to convince them of something, and they're trying to convince you of something, whether this word, and you go into all sorts of things about, can a person smile in this way, or is this thing appropriate? So anyway, so in this one particular chapter, I had a lot of convincing to do, because the tenses often shifted. So at the start of chapter 7 and at the end of chapter 7, there's a line about disorientation of senses and tenses, because at that point, this character is confronting something which fundamentally is affecting her, and she cannot think linearly at that point because of what she's just realized. So my definition anyway of love is that it's a disorientation of the senses and tenses. It's what kind of disorients our world, not just our senses, but also in terms of how we relate to the tenses of future and past and present, and what is the present, and what's the relationship between the present and the future. So in that particular chapter, there's this sentence that bookends the start and the finish of that chapter, because just to indicate that this is, to the reader, that this is, and of course, as you go through the paragraphs, you realize that this character is actually thinking non-linearly, as we do. I mean, I always like to think that we can be in any one place, for instance, all of us here in this room right now, but in our heads, we can at any point, should we want to be, and perhaps are, in multiple places, and we can be 5-year-olds in our head on one sunny afternoon. We can imagine something into our future and think about it. We can think about a certain important interaction we had with somebody, and it's just, isn't it incredible that here we are, these human beings on this little tiny speck, which in the vastness of the universe is just one tiny speck, but here we are, all of these beings with these multiple kind of time trajectories, and all sorts of interesting things happen. And
well, yes, and I think that goes back also to your sentence with the brain, it's imprisoned in the skull, but on the other hand, it has these infinite possibilities. Now, we've got this other wonderful section which starts, there are 60 Chinese words for death. Now, you would think 60 Chinese words for death a lot, but then the next sentence is, too few, Shireen thought. And then we get into a whole section about death. And again, I think it's, as I say, the richness of the paragraphs. It's not to be raced through. It's not a racy novel, because there's all this deep meaning and deep thought behind it. Perhaps you could give us a little sort of eye-opener to how you came to, get into the Chinese characters for death.
So the idea of, one sort of, people often ask you, what is a novel about, and you have. It's always hard to summarize something that's a book-length thing into a story. But for Residue, my line used to be, well, residue is about what remains in us when we move on from events and when we move across borders. So, the stuff that remains in us, the remainder of things. And for this one, I think that one line would be the what happens to big dreams on small canvases that are shrunk even smaller by the politics of conflict. So, what happens to people who have these dreams in their lives, and then there's, already life affords us very little, and then with the politics of conflict, that canvas becomes shrunk even smaller. And so this connection with, So there's a sort of, the book is focused on Kashmir. The characters are Kashmiri. It's set in various parts of Kashmir, but prominently Srinagar, which is, of course, a place I'm originally from and know very well, and that's why I would, write in such detail about it. But there are things that play a role, kind of that haunt, sort of are in the backdrop. And one of those places like that, for a reason, is Hong Kong. And this kind of this thing with China and Hong Kong, and it's just something in the, so Shireen has never been to Hong Kong, but there's a connection of her family, and she kind of looks at
Shireen
Hong
is
Kong.
the granddaughter of a former spy.
Yes, of somebody who has a connection to China. So she's this granddaughter, and she's never been, and her grandfather is now dead. But she kind of looks at Hong Kong on this map, and it always has this fascination because she's seen as a child things that were at that time incredibly rare and wonderful because they were from Hong Kong, and that she was able to access. Anyway, so her grandfather dies, and the line that Victoria is referring to, her grandmother and grandfather both are now dead, and the line is, there are 60 Chinese words for death, too few, Shireen thought, because when someone died, there were a million ways to not be able to express what that death signified. And if you want, I can continue reading.
Yes, no, just read that little passage, because I think it's
Okay.
rather beautiful.
This dawn, when the dark autumnal sky was still a shadowy ghost, pressing against the window pane of her room, she had searched online for death in Chinese and blinked away the insistent tears in her eyes. On a screen in front of her, blurred by teardrops, she could see death, arranged by status or rank. Had a king died? Had a commoner died? By age. Childhood, middle, or old age? By special reasons or circumstances? Died for love? For one's moral integrity? By religion, only Buddhist and Taoist here. Literary terms for death or suicide? Ended oneself? Ascended to heaven? Judgmental terms of praise? Humor or derogation? A righteous death or a stretching of one's legs? And then it goes on to give us, tell us what she has just learned, who has just died, and why she is feeling the way she's feeling.
The reason I'm drawing attention to this is because I think, again, we're talking about Shireen and her reaction to death, and it's a very clever vehicle to make the reader stop and take stock, rather than just expressing on a linear way death. It leaves something in the mind. And what I think, again, why do we all read novels? We read novels because they stay in the mind afterwards, and we think about them. And that's why I think the richness of this novel is that it's not just a story you think, well, you've read it, you've finished it, that's it, it's a novel, it's fiction, you're not interested. There are these certain passages where you sort of draw a halt and you suddenly think, okay, that relates to my own life. And I think that's where, why a novel is part of literature, because it stays with you as well. As do the great novels, that we've all grew up reading. And
stories are just really powerful, and so often, even without being aware of it, we pattern our lives sometimes on things that we have read, characters that we have identified with, things that we emote for. And I think this is something that, and especially at certain times of crises, like what she's going through at that point, the non-linearity, I think, is really powerful, because although for interactions with our world, we all have our armors, right? When soldiers go to war, they put on their armor. For some of us, the armor is a smile. For others, the armor is makeup. For still others, the armor is uniform, and so on. But the way we maintain the dailiness of our lives requires a lot of kind of tidying up and putting things into the cupboards that we think we'll get to at some point later. And that's partly what she reflects on, how sometimes we never get to, open those cupboards that we thought someday we'll attend to in our mind.
Yes, we don't have time. Now, Nitasha, this book, it's obviously written from the heart because it is about Kashmir. It's about Kashmiri characters. Have you also written it for Kashmiris, that they will read it, that they will, in a way, draw strength and themselves identify with the characters?
So my dearest wish is actually to be, to actually be reading this book, to actually be talking about this book, and to actually have this book at some place like, say, Nehru.
Gulshan Books,
Gulshan
books
Bookstore
in
on
Nehru,
Nehru Park.
yes.
That is my dream.
I'd love to be there doing.
Where, I would
Yes.
I would give anything to be.
Yeah.
So in the center of Srinagar, there is the Dal Lake, as you know, and in the center of in one part of Dal Lake, there's a little island. And in that island, on the island is called Nehru Park. On that island, there is a bookstore. It's a very small island, so you have a little shikara ride. So that bookstore is called Gulshan Bookstore. They also have a city branch, but this is the picturesque one.
Yes.
So, and it's just one of those places that you can be there in the middle of everything, and you're struck by both the grandeur and also the tragedy of a place, because you stand there and you look at these mountains around, and the lake is ringed by these lampposts that are almost like, I think at some point in the book I talk about this necklace of light
Yes,
that
yes.
the lake is wearing. But it is also, it's not just that, it's also all the soldiers, it's also all the, so the kind of, it strikes you with a force. Anyway, and books are time travel machines, right? So that, in my head, I hope, I pray, in my head, that is where, essentially Kashmiris are the people who I would absolutely love to have, to be able to read it. And some of them have been able to get the book, but it's just really hard right now. And I don't even know, how or when that is going to be possible, but that is my dream.
And we need dreams.
I
and
did
hopes.
actually, for Residue, I was able to realize that. We
You
did
were,
have this incredible
yes.
conversation there with, with Gaur in that bookstore, and with a large number of people and young people, and it was just really beautiful. So yes, because it's of course anyone can resonate with a story, but I think that a story of Kashmiris, of their lives, by a Kashmiri, set in Kashmir, of course, without a doubt,
Without
it has
a
to
doubt.
be read in
Yes,
Kashmir.
yes. No. And I think, I'm sure, well, I also like to remain an optimist, and I hope, inshallah, that will happen. But I'm sure that those who do read it will be able to identify and resonate, because
Perhaps in the post offices of hope, perhaps there's some line that some character at
Yes.
some point in the book thinks of, these post offices where there are little parcels of hope, and maybe one of them is for her. So yes.
Yes.
Maybe we all have
Well,
those little parcels of hope.
I can chat on quite happily with Nitasha, because I really love the book, and having myself been privileged to go to Kashmir on a number of occasions, even I, as a non-Kashmiri, feel I can identify with your characters. The cover, it does, as Nitasha said, her name is in barbed wire, but it also shows the the beauty of the lake and the shikara, and then the bird flying for
I suppose.
freedom, some element of.
Yes. I don't know how I would interpret it. I would have interpreted it more positively before, and now it's just, I don't know, it's like one of those, okay, if I may just put on my philosopher academic hat
Yes,
for
no,
a
we
bit.
like the philosophy.
Derrida talks about the gift as being also the pharmacon, being both the cure and also a kind of poison. So it's that. We don't really know. It's just kind of that.
Yeah, but we don't know. It is one of
And
the
also
tragedies.
the red,
Yes.
It was always going to be red, but then it again got a whole new significance with August onwards, with red being that color for Stand for Kashmir. So yeah.
Well, I think now, we have some time, and I don't want to just,
Yes,
use the audience. So let's have questions. So, can we have a mic? Yeah, thank you. That was lovely. Good.
Thank you. Welcome to Lahore.
Thank you.
My maternal ancestors migrated from Amritsar, which used to be a Kashmiri city, because there were waves of migration from the Dogra dynasty, and Lahore was the other beneficiary.
Yes.
And of course, you're very lucky to talk about this novel on Kashmir in Lahore. Actually, I'm interested in talking to you. I haven't read the novel, regretfully. This whole idea of Kashmiriyat, which predates the nation states of India and Pakistan. For me, Kashmiriyat means this very inclusive and syncretic thing where Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Pandits, all of them, were living together, and of course goes back to Sikandar Butchikan, the Rajas, and and of course, in India and Pakistan, we keep talking about how we're going to parcel this between the two countries, but no one talks about this whole idea of Kashmiriyat. And of course, and it's a very viable third option. In fact, I would even say Kashmiris have to show us a way. The hate which we have built about each other in both India and Pakistan, harking back to that whole idea. So how does your novel speak to Kashmiriyat? That idea which is probably also realized when Muslims used to rule Spain, or the Ottomans used to rule Turkey. Jews were ministers over there. They reached the highest level. I hope I'm not speaking utopian nonsense, but I do believe that maybe that sort of a thing is even possible now in the time of nation states and nationalism and hate and vile and bile. So yeah, I just want to ask you, how does your novel speak to that Kashmiriyat, and is it even possible now, that whole idea and ideal in the 21st century? Because we're not even sure if the nation state is going to survive, the onslaught of globalization.
Thank you. That's a good question. Yeah. Let's take your question too, and we'll do that one.
No, but shall I take the other one as well?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Let's take this lady's question. Oh, hello? Have you got a question? Yeah. Well, we'll take them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Nitasha. My name is Kiran. I'm a journalist, and my ancestors moved here at the time of Jammu massacre, so it has a very significant role, and I couldn't go back there. I want to one day, but to see the recent and current events, I certainly cannot, but I have lots of friends. So I met them in Istanbul. Some of them are studying there. So one line my friend said, we were sitting at the ocean side, and he said that Kashmiris are not resisting because they are suffering. They are suffering because they are resisting. The day they stop their resistance, their suffering will end. Your book is based on future tense. So what do you think that the young generation of now, this time, has to do to secure a better future for the coming generation, both from the Pakistan and Indian side of Kashmiris? Because there were 2 million people who migrated at the time of Jammu massacre, and they are still living in Pakistan, and I am the second generation here, but now we do not talk about Kashmir in our house, because we're sitting in a comfortable home and in our rooms, so we do not even bother to go back or to look back. But my grandfather and grandmother used to say that we are settlers. I have also written about this. But what kind of strength or struggle or anything, any movement, although it's been going for a long time, but what do you think that we have to do as Kashmiris living in Pakistan to maybe might go back to our homeland?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. At this point, I almost feel so guilty that I can't just give you my books for free. I'm so sorry, because they have to be got. Because I would love for everyone to just be able to read these stories, because that's exactly what, I totally, that really, both of your comments touch a nerve, because I think that, partly as a writer and as somebody who has that very complicated relationship with the homeland, which is multiply there's Kashmir, India, then there's Kashmir, UK, India, UK, then there's all of these paradoxes of meeting people, like you said, you meet people from this and that side of the line of control, also very strange words, line of control. People from this and that side of the line of control meet on the other side of the world. For me too, this has been like yourselves, it has been a journey. So the residue was set in Berlin. Now you would say, why Berlin? Because it's about Kashmiris outside of Kashmir who are looking and as a divided city, and the divisions and absences in people's minds and imagination. That's what it was trying to reference. But future tense is a lot more immediate in that way, because it is about those histories, our histories that predate any nation states, that predate the Treaty of Westphalia, through which we get the nation state system. These are things, that identities that speak of a time when people could say, their country, and essentially they would mean their village or the local area in which they lived, because that was their immediate sense of belonging. That was, to them, that was what it meant to be that person. And then suddenly you have this grid of, problematically imposed nation states and people being bargained and bartered over their heads. And suddenly you find a world where there are entire collectives that have become the casualty of this kind of line drawing and this kind of endless shadow boxing and real wars too. So I think fiction and my work anyway, I see that as a kind of witnessing of this long-tailed present that we've got, this kind of really long-tailed present, which isn't just about the present, but it's also all of the echoes of those pasts, and that witnessing is important. Agha Shahid Ali, the Kashmiri American poet that I'm sure you've read, but if you haven't, you must. His line about your history gets in the way of my memory, and he's not just referring to one identity. And at the same time, he's also talking about one day we shall meet at the gates of peace, and so we have to, in a situation which is simultaneously hopeless, and hopeful, we have to kind of deal with that essential conflict and somehow keep hoping that it will be possible for us to do better than the divides and the endless conflict and the lack and the suffocation. I mean, I was really pleased when some of the people who were the first people to read the book, you will see Wahid's name is there, and Andrew Whitehead, who's a mutual friend, and he had said that and people who read the book and they said, well, there is a kind of a message of hope somewhere in that story which they could sense. So for me that was quite heartening to think that we must always retain some measure of hope in all of this. And I think in these stories, what I'm trying to do is, through the stories of these characters and their lives and their dreams, also, I mean, politics is the political situation is a big part. In fact, it's almost like central to it. It's just not written as it's not a political, it's not a academic text, but actually all of that politics is embodied in the lives and characters and the interactions of these people. And so I think that's what I would have.
I think one has
what
to
can
keep
they
hope.
do? Yeah, and your question about what can they do? Yesterday, I think it was you. I think you mentioned resist to exist or
Yes,
resist
to
resist.
exist. Yes.
So
it's very powerful.
It is important to remember that we don't, as someone said, we don't grow. We don't stop living because we grow old. We grow old because we stop living. So likewise. Yes. We don't stop resisting in order to exist. I mean, resistance is existence. So that's where our resilience comes from as people. You can at some point, circumstances may force us to just resign to circumstances. And that play between resignation and indignation at what the world is throwing at us, that's what makes the substance of our lives. And different people are able to pursue different combinations of that in terms of what they choose to do as work, how they choose to express themselves, and so on. But yeah, I think
we've got two more questions. I mean, I just wanted to explain. I was going to try and see if I could find the photograph. The resist to exist was someone who was actually for fashion. Had brought the ferran into sort of more common use, that it was actually a beautiful garment, the ferran. And she'd got a poster, but instead of the sort of just embroidery that you'd normally have, she had the map of Kashmir, and it's in red and white. I'll see if I can get it up and I'll show you. Have you seen it? It's your Twitter display. Well, in New York, I met the girl whose sister had this idea. And it's the resist to exist, and it's a very powerful statement. And I think this is all, what Natasha's response. It's all our being. Is when you stop, resisting, you stop existing in a way.
And symbols are so powerful.
Anyway, we have two questions here. Yeah, yes, this gentleman, and then this lady. We'll take the two together again.
Thank you. I wanted to just comment that your effort to describe the personal lives in a conflict which is so pervasive, which is so permanent, is a very good exercise. In our lifetime, we have seen so much of senseless, permanent, massacrous, and very barbarous wars, starting from Vietnam, then Afghan, then Iran, Iraq, then Mauritania, then Bosnia, then again this Yemen, and all this thing. Nowhere has the literary circles ever emphasize the human cost the human sufferings in a literary sense that can relate to us. I can imagine Dr. Zhivago taking me to that revolution. That was such a way of, making an empathy to that. I think your exercise in this thing will take us out of just the newsrooms, out of just the apathy of routine information coming over to us, and we have witnessed the most barbarous half-century in the humankind. I have sometimes...
What is your question?
What I want to say is, it's not a question. It's
Oh,
actually a
a
tribute
statement.
that
Right.
I commend you that you have highlighted the human sufferings in the backdrop of a very barbarous situation. And that way we can understand it better. And I
Yes,
think
well,
please
that's...
continue with
yeah,
that thing.
thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure Nitasha will be grateful.
Yeah.
Have you a question? Yeah.
Thank you.
And the lady behind. We'll take this too.
Thank you so much for coming to Pakistan and doing what you do. I have family in Kashmir, and it is so sad that, I have not been able to share my unfiltered thoughts with them and vice versa. It's, since the past few years. And my question is that do you see unification in the ideation or what do you see unification in the ideation of what Kashmiris want for themselves now? Because, like, for example, in my house, like two of my cousins, they're brothers, and they have conflicting views about their future. So what would you, say about that today?
Okay, how do Kashmiris view the future? It's complicated. Let's have the lady behind as well. Yeah, because that was a statement, so we'll have two questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your thoughts. I have a question about your publishing journey. So obviously, like, writing a book about Kashmir, something that's so politically turbulent in India right now, or even across the world, like, how does that work? Because I can imagine in Pakistan writing something about, say, Balochistan, or, something that people don't want to read, or is going to make them think twice about what they're consuming. So how was your experience?
Difficulties of publishing. Yeah. Okay.
So
Thank you.
Thank you. Symbols are important. I'll take up that thread there and work my way through. So symbols are really important. I have to see that picture, obviously. I remember that in 2010, the stone pelting summer, that summer, which was so tragic. That summer, I was at the other end of the Himalayas, and there was the place that I lived in. There was a stone quarry right next to it, and so there would be these people who would be slicing stones the whole day, and I had gone there to escape a lot of things and to kind of just do something different. But of course, Kashmir was the only thing on my mind, so I would just be reading about all of this, at the other end of the mountains. And the stones were real in terms of what I was reading and what was happening and how important stones were to all of this, but also stones were in my immediate environment. So I did this thing on it still exists on my Facebook album. I just made I went to the quarry and I found stones that were shaped specific ways and half cut and whatever to make a stone pelter's figure out of stones. Which to me was sort of like a librarian made out of books in one of the classical paintings, and then I put that on Facebook about with this thing on a stone for your silence and another one for the violence, and sometimes we have symbols are really important, and stones were that symbol for me at that point. Now thank you for your comments. I think yes, stories really are powerful, and I mean, you think about revolution, and you think about Paris, and you think about Les Miserables. You think about all these people singing together and revolting. So stories have a really powerful role, and they also can confront us with asking certain very fundamental questions about the nature of violence or the nature of who do we owe our affinities to in residue. I mean, that's a central question. Are our affinities chosen or elected? Do we choose who we care for, or is that just somehow a consequence of something instinctual? Anyway, so yes, literature allows us that, and it's really powerful, and this is why I think that both the analytical aspect and the affective aspect of my work are equally dear and important to me. Like this is not a replacement for an academic text on Kashmir, for instance. But neither is that a replacement for this. I feel like they're both doing things that make meaning in different domains. The thing, yes, yes, it is truly tragic. And what does, so one of the things that this book also looks at is, what does being Kashmiri mean? How can we talk about the stories of different kinds of Kashmiri identities, regional, religious? How do we have those conversations? Who feels silenced in? What are the histories that people aren't able to relate to? And if not, what does that mean? How will that matter going forward into the future? So those are essentially, very central questions in terms of the book and the interactions that develop in the book. Your question about family differences, yes, I mean that's just within families. Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. So do you mean inside a person, or do you mean inside inside a family? Yes. So yes, absolutely. There's you have, that's so much the consequence of so many lives, including my own. There are so many of us that, that speak about the sufferings of Kashmiris, and there are, we've got our sense of who or what we can relate to as family has shrunk ever smaller, because your cousins or people that you grew up with, there is no way for a conversation to be made possible because of how politics has shaped people's views going over time. So yes, people often come up to me, young people, and they say, well, can you tell, how do I deal with, I can see the sense in this, but how do I relate to my family, to people who are posting in these WhatsApp groups and who have a completely different message and understanding of the reality? So that is, I think, on every side, in every situation, that is just a fact, that is just, but I would take it one step further, which is why I asked you about whether it's inside a person. So in Thoreau's, somebody I'm very fond of. I mean, I feel like most of the people I'm fond of are just not in this universe. I cannot talk to them anymore. But Henry David Thoreau, the 19th century philosopher, in his essay on civil disobedience, which is available everywhere online, in his essay on civil disobedience, at one point he talks about, the importance of doing what you think is the right thing, because yes, of course, he says, of course it divides people, it divides the church, it divides the state and families. It even divides within an individual the diabolical from the divine. And I think that is something to do with conscience. I mean, if we believe that the sufferings of other people and the stories of other people are real, and that they merit an understanding, and that we ought to care, and if we are then confronted with a side of ourselves or other voices in the world that say, no, let's just be apathetic, don't care, why care about, that is a divide. I mean, we can only hope to keep trying to overcome that, but most of our lives are, if we live them with some measure of conscience, it's that absurd rationale of we can't go on, we must go on. And that's both of those aspects are real. Your bit about yes, it's truly really hard. I will not underemphasize how hard it is to be heard as a person who says what I do about Kashmir and who wants herself to be read. So when my first novel, Residue, and I've just told you what it's about, it was the only way that I would have, that it made the light of day was because it was shortlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize, which at that point you could, even if you didn't have a contract, you could submit your manuscript. And I did, and it was one of the 5 novels chosen from Asia. So it was, that's how that happened essentially. And this, and for Future Tense, likewise, I mean, it's I haven't yet seen an Indian press review of it. There are people who will do press reviews. I mean, okay, fair enough, it only came out less than a month ago. But am I holding my breath that a whole lot of Indians will pay attention to it? I mean, yes, people, yes. But do I think that a lot of media houses will take that step and will review it? I don't know. I hope so. I hope there will be people who will want to do things like that. But I don't know. So, it's one of those. But if you really, I don't want that to sound like that's just a feature of the times, right? It's people either want to censor you and silence you, or they want to pretend that you don't exist. And this is why, for me, it's important that people read my book. Because if you think that, not just a book, whatever you're doing, if you think that there is worth in doing it, continue doing it. There's, it's just, the universe finds ways. Plus, with literature, stories, or anything that you do, the true measure of anything is not today. It's, it's someone somewhere who at some point reads something and it makes meaning for them. And that really is important and profound, and that's what really matters. So,
thank you, Nitasha. Well, I think that's a fantastic note to read on, to finish on. And I think we've had a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, and I hope you've all taken away something from it.